Добрый день, глубоко уважаемые коллеги и гости. Позвольте заседание диссертационного совета по защите диссертации Ермолаевой Любови Андреевны на соискание ученой степени кандидата экономических наук по специальности 08-2005 «Экономика и управление народным хозяйством. Менеджмент» на тему «Реализация зарубежных сделок, слияний и поглощений»
by Russian companies, process analysis model. According to the orders, St. Petersburg University, they dated 21st of October 2019, number 10297, me, Shirokova Galina Viktorovna, Doctor of Economics, Professor of the Department of Strategic and International Management, St. Petersburg University, was appointed chairman of this dissertation council. Also, let me introduce my fellow council members. Gavrilova Tatiana Albertovna, Doctor of Technical Sciences, Head of Department of Information Technologies and Management, St. Petersburg University. Zavyalova Elena Kirillovna, Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Head of the Department of Organizational Behavior and Personnel Management at St. Petersburg University. Rogova Elena Moiseyevna, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor of the Department of Finance, Dean of the Faculty of St. Petersburg School of Economics and Management, National Research University, High School of Economics. In the remote mode we have Svetla Marinova, Doctor of Economics, University of Aalborg, Denmark. First, let me emphasize that according to the federal law of the 23rd of August 1996, number 127, on science and the state scientific and technical policy, St. Petersburg University has the right to award academic degrees independently. The corresponding order on the procedure of awarding the academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, on the basis of which we are holding this session of the Council, was issued on the 1st of September 2016, number 6821/1. In accordance with this order, a session of the Dissertation Council is duly constituted if at least 2/3 of the approved members of the Council are participating, but not less than 4 persons. Our Dissertation Council consists of 5 members. All 5 members are present, including 1 member of the Council in a remote interactive mode. The audio-visual contact has been established with her. Thus, we have a quorum. Let me set forth the procedure of today's session with a total duration of no more than 2 hours. The chairman's summary report on the main content of documents submitted by the applicant and their compliance with the requirements. Answers to possible questions, 5 minutes. A brief presentation by the degree applicant outlining the key findings of her study, no more than 15 minutes. Questions to the applicant strictly on her report, no more than 2 minutes per question, and answers of the applicant. Speeches of all members of the Dissertation Council with their reviews and statements of their opinions, questions and suggestions to the applicant, no more than 10 minutes for each speaker. Speech of the chairman and her review, answers of the applicant to questions and comments of the members of the Dissertation Council, no more than 15 minutes. Open discussion, speeches of the attendees with summary of their positions and specific questions and suggestions to the applicant strictly on the topic of the study, no more than 5 minutes per person. To do that, all the speakers are kindly requested to put their names on the registration sheet and introduce themselves in full before speaking. 8. Final answers of the applicant to questions asked, no more than 5 minutes. 9. Speech of the academic advisor, no more than 3 minutes. A 5-minute discussion before the open voting on awarding or not awarding the SPBU academic degree to the applicant. For the time of this discussion, the broadcasting shall be suspended. 11. Open individual voting. The chairman of the council shall count the votes and the results shall be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. 12. A decision on awarding or not awarding the academic degree to the applicant, and 13 closing remarks of the applicant, no more than 2 minutes. If anyone has any questions or objections, let's start with the official procedure. Before we start the official procedure, let me remind you to switch off your mobile phones. Thank you for your understanding. Let me also inform you that our meeting shall be recorded and broadcast online at SPBU website, and the speeches shall be simultaneously translated from Russian into English or from English into Russian. So I shall now begin the meeting, and our first item is the Chairman's Summary Report. The thesis by Ermolaeva, Liubov, Andreevna for the degree of Candidate of Economic Sciences, Specialization 080005 Economics and the National Economy Management, on implementation of foreign mergers and acquisitions by Russian companies, a process analysis model, was accepted for defense by the order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg University on the 18th of October 2019, 10276/1. The Dissertation Council was appointed by the order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg University on the 23rd of October 2019, number 10297/1, and I have already introduced its members to you, dear colleagues and guests. The applicant submitted the following documents to the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg University. An application to the Rector of St. Petersburg University, Professor Kropotchev, to accept the dissertation for consideration and defense, submitted on the 6th of September 2019. A review by the academic advisor, Pani Bratov Andrei Yurievich, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor of the Department of Strategic and International Management of St. Petersburg State University. A list of 9 publications outlining the main scientific results of the thesis, including 3 publications in peer-reviewed scientific journals from the list approved by the Ministry of Education and Science of Russia, and 6 publications in journals indexed in the scientific databases Web of Science and Scopus. 4 certificate of candidate examinations of the 17th of January 2018, number 04812, issued by St. Petersburg University, that Ermolaeva, Liubov, Andreevna has passed the candidate exams in specialization 080005 Economics and Management of the National Economy with the following results: Philosophy, excellent; English, excellent; Economics and Management of the National Economy, good. Postgraduate Diploma, AS 00202, issued on the 1st of August 2017, St. Petersburg University, certifying that Ermolaeva, Liubov, Andreevna was awarded a qualification researcher, a lecturer researcher in the discipline Economics and Management by the decision of the State Examination Commission on the 29th of June 2017. The thesis in Russian and in English, on paper, the rise of manuscript, and in the electronic form. The thesis has been formatted in accordance with the requirements of GOST State Standard R7.0, printed on a multiplier with indication of the output data according to the State Standard R704. It should be noted that all the documents listed above comply with Clause 12, Section 3, Thesis, Presentation and Defense, the procedure for awarding the academic degrees of St. Petersburg University, Annex 1 to the order. Now, let's hear the brief presentation of the applicant. I'm giving the floor to the applicant. You have exactly 15 minutes, please. Good afternoon, dear council members, dear colleagues. Today, let me introduce my thesis. This implementation of foreign mergers and acquisitions by Russian, the process analysis model. The thesis was executed at St. Petersburg University. My academic advisor was Professor Pani Bratov. Relevance of my research: mergers of acquisitions transactions are the engine of the foreign direct investment, especially among companies from emerging economies, as they allow them to quickly acquire strategic resources, technological inventions, and global brands. Russian companies are fairly new in international markets, but already starting with 2004, Russia's among the top foreign investors in the world, and among Russian companies and other companies from emerging economies. cannot always be explained by the traditional theoretical approaches. International M&A are closely very uncertain and complex, and the need to deal with precision knobs of a foreign state institutional is a very important, significant factor for companies from emerging economies, because these transactions often become a subject of political relations and bureaucracy. For companies from emerging economies, institutional factors may become barriers in the way of an internationalization. Competitive advantages are important prerequisite for internationalization, and many companies from developing economies do not have the advantages that enable them to compete with foreign companies. Yet the number of companies, Russian companies, entering global markets. So what are the specific characteristics of companies with emerging economies that enable them to become competitive in international markets? So these prerequisites are still being discussed. So the purpose of my research was to evaluate factors of institutional factors, competitive advantages of a company, and the process of implementation of M&A transactions. So the subject of my study was Russian companies entering global markets. The object of my study was competitive advantages of Russian companies that shape their M&A policy. In my thesis, I define the M&A process. These are actions aimed at choice of a foreign market, negotiations on concluding a deal and its value that will give the company maximum competitive advantage. Theoretical approaches. Among the theoretical approaches leading transaction are transaction theory, resource approach, and institutional approach. In my thesis, for the theoretical basis, I used eclectic paradigm of J. Danning's. The eclectic paradigm of J. Danning is one of the most popular paradigms used to explain internationalization strategies employed by companies. It includes three key elements, such as O, ownership, specific company advantages, L, location of foreign market advantages, and R, internalization, benefits of using the domestic market. The most discussed element of this model, company advantages, in his later research, John Danning, advantages based on assets, transaction, and institutional advantages. So this division was also used in my thesis. And the institutional approach is very important if we talk about companies from emerging economies. Traditional studies evaluate foreign investments from the point of benefits. This can only partly explain internationalization of companies from emerging economies. And the study of weaknesses can only becomes possible with the use of institutional approach, the study of dynamic approach, the interaction between institutions. Researchers identify the following factors: factor of political stability as the key prerequisite for institutional environment for companies with emerging economies. As a result of literature analysis, I developed a model of implementation of foreign transactions by Russian companies. This model includes two stages: choice of market, and second stage is negotiations. In the institutional environment and political stability are the most important factors shaping transaction at each stage. And if rights of ownership are connected with the choice of market, it can be shape negotiations. And speaking of political stability, we also have such hypotheses. Political stability in a foreign market can be inversely related to the choice of market and directly related to competitive advantage of Russian companies can be divided in three types. Competitive advantages based on assets, always connected with the choice of a foreign market and successful conclusion of a deal. But in case of a certain stage, these competitive advantages may be moderated by a political alliance between Russia and a foreign state. Institutional advantages of Russian companies act as moderators between institutional factors and concluding stages of an M&A deal. Empirical design of this study. I looked at Russian companies invested abroad from 2000 to 2000 and conclude the M&A deal. We used Zephyr Van Dyke database, which include all announced, completed, and unfinished transactions. Originally, I looked at 2,000 examples, and a sample, final sample included 310 observations. The analysis I conduct in two stages. Stage 1, linear regression analysis, and stage 2, I analyze the same advantages and same factors, which were somehow connected with the deal implementation after negotiations. For that, I used the two-step Heckman model, which enabled me to neglect unfinished transactions. And the dependent variables. Stage 1 was the value of an transaction. Stage 2, we had two variables. First was binary variable, which equaled 1 if negotiation ended, with conclusion and 0 if not. And at stage 2 was value of the M&A transaction. That was my second variable. Independent variables were factors of the institutional environment, such as political stability, protection of property rights, and specific advantages of a company. Asset-based advantages were coming from oil and gas sector, transactions, company size, and belonging to a business group. And institutional advantages was state ownership. Results of my empirical analysis, I validated 7 out of 10 hypotheses. Each hypothesis related to stage 1 or stage 2, and include all the factors I have already listed. The following hypothesis I have validated. Protection of property rights in a foreign is directly related to the value of the planned transaction. High level of political stability in a foreign country is inversely related to the cost of planned M&A transaction. At that, the higher the level of political stability in a foreign country, the more likely it is that a Russian company will conclude the transaction. Speaking of advantages, Russian company, I made the following hypotheses, and most of the hypotheses have been validated. Asset-based and transaction advantages are directly related to the value of planned M&A transactions and successful negotiations. Yet, at the validation stage, indeed, political relations becomes a moderator. State ownership in a company positively moderates the relationship between the value of the transaction. Also, if a state-owned company, the likeliness of based on the results of my empirical analysis, I made the following conclusions. Process of M&A transaction factor of institutional environment and competitive advantages of the company change the vector of their influence. The main factor that changes its value in the course of negotiations from negative to positive value, this is political stability in the foreign market. The main economic reason for M&A transaction is the entry of consumers into the market, while developed institutional environment hinders successful implementation of transactions primarily by state companies. The institutional advantage of Russian at that state companies more than follow the plan more than others, and Russian MNCs combine features specific to the emerging market with context-specific features, novelty. As a result of my study, my companies from emerging economy highlighted, I developed my personal approach to find the process of foreign M&A transactions, developed an empirical model of interrelation of institutional environment factors and competitive advantages of the firm with different stages of M&A transaction implementation. The two-stage empirical study of the process model of M&A transaction. I developed a strategy of empirical study of identified specific advantages of Russian companies, which in certain contexts become weaknesses, namely state ownership, has been justified in terms of Duning's institutional approach and theoretical concept. The theoretical contribution is in my thesis. Explaining M&A implementation by companies from emerging companies, specifically Russia. So contributed to the development of John Dunning's theoretical concept by explaining the changing role of the institutional advantages of emerging market companies in the process of their internalization. The practical contribution is as follows. Explanation of why foreign M&A transactions fail, and what factors of the external environment, especially institutional factors, should be taken into account when planning a foreign takeover. The relevance is change in knowledge and practices of foreign operations in the business environment, as well as the institutional support for companies in the home market. As a result of my research, I published several articles, 3 articles, journals approved by the Russian Ministry, and 6 articles. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your presentation. Now it's time has come for questions strictly to the presentation, no more than 2 minutes for one question. Dear colleagues, dear members of the Dissertation Council. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have 2 questions, maybe connected to each other. My first question is, when you showed us the stages, at which stage valuation takes place and valuation of synergy effects? And my second question is probably connected with the first one. Transaction is successful or unsuccessful only depending on if it was concluded or not. You never mentioned the case where transaction is concluded with a significant premium for a Russian company, and maybe the Russian company may invest a lot but never get this money back. Did you take this factor into account? Let me answer your question, Elena Vasilyevna. First of all, about valuation of a transaction. I did not consider various financial indicators because my emphasis was on managerial decisions such as choice of a foreign market and negotiations. And that is why I didn't consider this factor directly. And speaking of successful or unsuccessful negotiations, indeed, in my model, the decisive factor was whether a transaction was concluded or not. And indeed, a deal can be concluded, but well, the premium for a Russian company may not be so good. Dear colleagues, Svetla, maybe you have any questions?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I have quite a few questions, but I'll limit myself to just two. The first question is about the mediators and the controls you used in your research. I mean, in terms of mediators, did you consider actually some additional mediators that might affect the success of the transaction? I see that political stability is very important and institutional maturity, and that takes me back to the model with John, affecting the different learning that firms have to do in foreign markets. So this is my first question about the additional mediators or factors that might affect the conclusion of the merger and acquisition deal in foreign markets. Considering a pleiad of factors that might impact specifically Russian firms. This is about the uniqueness of your contribution. And the second point I wanted to make, did you also consider, and I have to go back to the price at point at which a merger or acquisition, specifically in acquisitions, has been made? Because then my question is, would John Dunning's OLI paradigm be more applicable, or it would be the LLL paradigm of John Matthews, or perhaps the composition-based view by John Child and Yao Dong Luo, where there are ordinary sort of resources, and with them their combination may produce extraordinary results? So, a bit complex questions, Luba.
Мне кажется, я поняла вопросы, хотя не очень.
I hope I understood your questions, though I couldn't hear you very well. Speaking of additional mediators and or factors that I could include in my model, mediators or factors which are specific to Russia. Speaking of additional mediators, I did not consider any, but I include various controlled variables such as historical links, connections between Russia and foreign countries. And I also consider such factors as the language factor, which reflects such informal institute such as Slavic languages. These factors I considered as variables, though I did not look at them as mediators. And speaking of the transaction itself and a share of percentage of acquired shares or applicability of OLI model, can it be applied to emerging markets, John Dunning's model? This OLI paradigm can be applied to other countries, other emerging economies. In my opinion, Russian companies have features which are typical for all emerging economies, and some features which are specific to Russian companies. And speaking of advantages, which I divided into three types, I grouped them as related to Russian companies. Yet, at the same time, for example, Chinese companies can also be considered with the same model in mind, and advantages based on assets. I included belonging to the oil and gas industry. This is a bigger advantage for Russian companies as compared to Chinese or Indian companies, for example. At the same time, I think that in each specific case for emerging economies, this model will only work if we interpret these competitive advantages correctly. So what exactly are the competitive advantages of a company from this particular country? Because companies from emerging countries are often grouped together. They have many unique features that should be taken into account. Thank you. Tatiana Albertovna, your question. You use the term process model. So my first question is, what do you mean by this term? Because the process that you described in your thesis includes only 2 stages. And when we talk about processes, we usually take into consideration the time factor. Tatiana Albertovna, indeed, I call my model a process model, and I do this because I look at dynamics of interactions of different factors at 2 stages. Of course, 2 stages is not a complete process. As a part of a process which takes more time, but I think my main contribution is in looking at institutional factors that first influence the process in one way and then they change their vector. And so maybe the political stability at this stage of maybe is not very important at the initial stage, but then in the second stage it becomes more important. So my aim was to look how the impact of different factors changes over the time. Okay, thank you. That was a good answer. But if you use the word process, maybe it could be, you could describe it in more details. But if you look at only these 2 major points, then you get a very gross model. Thank you. I have several questions, please. First of all, thank you for your interesting presentation. How can your theoretical model, the framework of your study, you mentioned is it the institutional approach? I've got several questions here. So first of all, which institutional theory have you used in your theoretical model, your empirical model? Is it an economic theory or social theories by Scott, etc.? And so what exactly institutions have you considered? So that's what I would like to know. My second question is about the results. You say that political stability in a foreign is one of the key factors for implementation of your model. Could you expand on this a little bit? How do you explain this, for example, from the point of institutional theory or other theories? And could you also explain if we talk about M&A transactions with in a foreign country, does your model has any specific features if a foreign state, a foreign country is a developed economy or is it an emerging economy state? What are the differences? Are there any in your model in these 2 cases? And my last question about the modern geopolitical situation, which we cannot ignore. How is the existing sanctions influence, or maybe will influence, or maybe will not influence your model and your conclusion and conclusions of your study. Galina Viktorovna, let me take your questions one by one. First question was about the institutional approach and the theoretical contribution. I used the economic theory of Glasnost. In my thesis, looked at formal institutions such as of course, there are many factors, not only political stability and protection of rights of ownership, but I chose these factors because they are important for companies from emerging economies, because very often the level of protection of ownership in domestic markets is very low, and this factor pushes companies to look for protection for their intellectual rights or the rights of ownership, and their political stability in this research is often mentioned as an important factor, because often in the political market, in the domestic market, political stability is low, and yet this factor does not scare national companies when they enter global markets, because they are used to political instability, and that is why maybe for companies from emerging economies, this factor maybe is less significant. And speaking of institutional, why I use institutional approach, it enables us to evaluate the role of the domestic market, because these factors, well, they depend on the situation in the domestic market, and if well, the rights of ownership are not protected enough in the domestic market, that explains why companies want to go international. Speaking of political stability, let me expand on this factor, which maybe that was maybe the most interesting finding. My hypothesis was that political stability is not important in the first stage, choice of market, because Russian companies are not scared of this. They can adjust to this, and yet in the negotiations stage, it happens that this factor becomes a negative factor, may affect negotiations in a negative way, and that means that political stability still may formally influence the process of negotiations, formal framework of negotiations, and this unstable situation and uncertainty may actually seriously influence negotiations. So in my opinion, this theoretical contribution and practical contribution, that I found that political stability in the end is very important. M&A transactions for developed and emerging economies. M&A transactions for in both countries, both thousand countries, are very important and very common. For companies from emerging economies, this very often is an opportunity to get quick access to resources, strategic resources, which they don't have, or companies with good management model, distribution networks. So that is the key difference between developed and emerging markets. And I speak about institutional advantages of the Russian companies, because these advantages enable them to conclude such transactions, whereas for companies from developed economies, that would not be possible, because for them institutional advantages are much less important. They're mostly based on assets and transaction advantage. And speaking of the current geopolitical situation and sanctions, my choice of transaction includes transactions concluded up to 2016. Sanctions already became effective during that period of time, and well, this affected in a way my my variables, and GDP of Russia was another variable that I used, and certainly this has an impact on the number of M&A transactions which countries are being chosen, some markets become less accessible, and some markets became more favorable for the Russian companies. And of course this was not the primary object of my study, but that is a very interesting sphere, and maybe in the future I can research this sphere more. Thank you, dear colleagues, dear members of the Council. If you have no further questions, Svetlo, please.
Right. Thank you very much. Luba, I understand the political stability and institutional maturity. One of the key questions in mergers and acquisitions is the issue of access to the resource and institutional capital in the host countries. In other words, in the countries where these mergers and acquisitions are struck. Because in your analysis, you rightly capture the political and institutional, the political stability and institutional maturity. And this can be both in the home and the host country. And while institutional maturity in the home country is very important to define the resource and political capital of the firm in its home market, the access to political and resource capital in the host country is a key deterrent for mergers and acquisitions. If there is no access, basically, that can negatively affect any mergers and acquisitions. So I think the issue of access is very, very important. And hence I had this question about, other factors. And Professor Shirokova also touched upon the sanctions as one of the factors. So when you did the analysis, did you try to see what happened? I don't like the word sanctions because sometimes I wonder when Russia has not been under sanctions of whatever type. But certainly the severity of the sanctions have limited the access of Russian firms to political and resource capital, especially in developed countries. So did you try to see how that might have had an impact on your hypothesis?
Пожалуйста.
I did not set myself this task, but what I would like to say is that institutional advantages of Russian companies that I mentioned, they work both when some political union between Russia and a foreign state at a normal level without any sanctions, and that was very visible in my model. Especially in the time of sanctions.
Okay.
At that, state ownership can also become a weakness. Can you hear me now? When a company tries to invest excuse us.
Okay.
A company with state ownership becomes a weakness if they invent in unfriendly economies. But I agree that accessibility of political and institutional capital in a foreign market is very important, and multinational companies try to achieve and it's something. This factor is very hard to measure. So maybe it can be measured by qualitative studies rather than quantitative methods. Thank you. If no one has any further questions, maybe any of the attendees have questions. No one has any questions. Let us then proceed to the next item on our procedure. That's reviews, including external reviews. We didn't get any external reviews. So we shall hear reviews by members of the Dissertation Council and the chairman. And we shall start with Tatiana Albertovna. Please tell us, would you like to present your whole review or only focus on the key points? Of course, I will not read my whole review because my review was available, and the subject of this study is very relevant. The list of literature is very impressive. The author has worked well with different sources. Yet, I have a number of comments. I also commented on novelty, and I think the author has made a significant contribution to theoretical. And despite the above-mentioned strength, there's also a number of shortcomings. First of all, speaking about the institutional factors, the author refers to formal institutions, while informal institutions are not taken into account. Perhaps it's necessary to explain and identify why only formal institutions are used when considering the process of implementing an M&A transaction, though informal ones obviously can also influence the process of negotiations and choice of a foreign market. It should be noted that in the course of M&A transaction, the choice of a target company is essential, and success of negotiations in many respects can depend on indicators of the target company revealed in the process of preparation. And the value also depends on the target. It's not clear how this serious component of the process is considered by the author in her empirical model, and if it's not taken account, then what is the reason? Three types of competitive advantage of Russian companies have been identified by the author. Asset-based transactional institutional advantages. How are Russian companies with this set of advantages differ from, for example, Chinese companies or other companies from developed or developing countries? The specific features of Russian companies could be revealed more in this thesis. Besides, I have some comments on the structure of the table of paragraphs in chapter 2 have formal names which don't give any idea of their content. And also the final paragraphs of the chapters have different titles, chapter conclusions or simple conclusions, although in general the structure and size of the chapters is quite well balanced. These shortcomings do not diminish the value or novelty of the research and significance of theoretical and practical conclusions, and I believe that the thesis by Liubov Ermolaeva is a full-fledged scientific study. Some good professional language and scientific statements presented by the author are sufficiently substantiated. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that the thesis by Liubov Andreevna Ermolaeva complies with the basic requirement system, and the applicant deserves the degree of Canon of Economic Sciences, specialty 08005. Thank you very much, Tatiana Albertovna, Liubov Andreevna. What will be your answer? Tatiana Albertovna, let me answer your comment about formal institutions. Indeed, I looked mostly at informal institutes, and I use them as controlled variables. So you look at such institutions as just and I have also looked at language. to control as informal, how informal institutes can control. But of course, I mostly focus on formal institutes. To answer your second about the choice of target company, this is indeed one of the key issues in an M&A transaction, and I specially excluded this factor because the choice of a target company, this deserves a specific can be the object of a specific study, and in my thesis I tried to focus on strategic decision making and on choice of company which a company wants to access, and but that's a separate decision. And secondly, on negotiations, when after the target company has been selected, negotiations in any case, negotiations will take place, and my key object here was successful or unsuccessful negotiations. And speaking of advantages of Russian companies and how they could be different from companies from other emerging markets, I think I have already mentioned that Russian companies have some advantages and some characteristics which are not typical to other emerging economies, such as belonging to the oil and gas sector, mining industry. State ownership is an important factor that should be taken into account more than in Brazil or India, for example. And also historical background of Russian companies is also very important, because many of the Russian major companies before were founded in Soviet times and emerged as new legal entities. But that may affect their international strategies. And speaking of the structure of the table of contents, I accept your critical remarks. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Zavyalova, Elena Kirillovna. Dear colleagues, I will not be original, and even with the comments, and the applicant has already answered some of the comments, and I would like to say that in the first part I found many positive features, practical, and one of the parts, well, I have to find some points for discussion, and here maybe the fact that the critical comments look quite similar, that means the applicant has worked hard, and we have similar, my first comment, similar opinions, is listing factors of institutional environment. I think the author should have explained the choice of specific characteristics of the institutional environment used in her work. A second comment, I think, was not mentioned. The author, this presents the process of implementing a foreign M&A transaction as a sequence of several stages: selection of the foreign market, conducting negotiations, and determining the value. However, in reality, these stages may not follow one another, but happen simultaneously. This.
Включите микрофончик, пожалуйста.
And there are some non-standard situations which often occur. So these become stimulus for future research. And another comment is about the Russian context. You have already answered this. And my fourth comment is oil and gas sector. Maybe the author should say how the oil and gas sector can be compared to other spheres of the national economy. These minor shortcomings do not reduce the importance of theoretical and practical conclusions, and my conclusion is that the applicant and the thesis deserve the degree of candidate of economic sciences. Thank you. Liubov Andreevna, what will be your answer? Dear Elena Kirillovna, let me answer two of your comments. Indeed, I use a simplified model that reflects general trends and characteristics, but of course it does not cover unusual situations, unique situations, and I think these can be reviewed separately, and so that's why looked at mostly at standard situations and a kind of a general model. Speaking of the oil and gas sector, it's really true. About 40% of transactions are deals concluded by oil and gas companies, which I think is a specific feature of the Russian economy. However, 60% of my sample is made of representative of other sectors of the economy, but they carry out only about 30% of the total volume of transactions in terms of value. So see this imbalance. And in my model, I included a variable which I used to look at industry sector, high-tech companies, and indeed, their behavior is very different because in every case, so their behavior is totally different from oil and gas companies. Okay, Professor Rogova, so let me give the floor to you. I think this. This is very interesting because my main focus is on mergers and acquisitions, and we just concluded a major study of factors that affect the value of transactions. So maybe we can become co-authors with Liubov Andreevna. And seriously speaking, I was very impressed by the thesis. So the author works well with sources, illustrates, gives good illustrations to her findings, and I would also like to praise the design of the study, which was very quite complex, and which illustrates proves the ability of the author to create her own models and to process data, and so we may trust the applicant's conclusions. And of course, I certainly have some critical remarks, and I also agree on novelty of the work, competitive advantages, and the author has proven that at different stages, different factors may have different value and different significance. And by way of critical comments, some have already been discussed, maybe, but I would like to get more detailed answers. Maybe the process of M&A process before acquisition, after acquisition, you introduced one more stage, implementation of M&A transaction, and for me, it's not quite clear why you decided to include this additional stage in addition to two common ones. Speaking of competitive advantages of Russian companies, you put them in three groups: asset-based, transactional, institutional. However, the work may only focus on the institutional advantages, and much less attention is paid to other types of advantages. So I have a question. How did you determine which transactional advantages relate to transaction advantages and what is the main difference between transaction and asset-based advantages. Speaking of the empirical model of introduce a controlled variable, sanctions, and define years of sanctions against Russia. However, it should be noted that sanctions in themselves only partly reflect the whole complex of difficulties faced by Russian companies that own businesses abroad. So a question arises: to what extent such a control variable really reflects the degree of complexities in the process of implementation of M&A transactions? And one of the important conclusions is the interrelations of same factors at different stages. At the same time, the explanation of this result for the institutional factors for competitive advantages can be made from the point of view of different theoretical approaches. But the author does not share these two sets of factors and justifies them theoretically, which deprives the thesis of additional theoretical depth. And speaking of empirical study, when we conduct an empirical study, we limit ourselves by minimum value or relative value of acquiring company. We do this to determine the significance of a transaction, because a transaction can be small and it may have no impact on the strategy of a company. And maybe I can understand why you did not use this factor, but could you please explain why you did not use this distinction? Yet these shortcomings do not affect the value of your results and do not reduce the significance of your conclusions. This is a very interesting thesis. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that the thesis meets the key requirements and the applicant deserves the degree of candidate of economics. Thank you. Elena Moiseyevna, please answer. Dear Elena Moiseyevna, you had 5 questions. So why did I introduce the process before acquisition is a launch stage, and at this stage, which includes many factors such as company valuation, environment valuation, and I have selected these 2 stages, a choice of market and negotiations, which in my opinion reflect the strategic intentions of a company. Choice of market is always related to strategy, and which was important for me. And well, the conclusion stage also shows how the company is capable, or if the company is capable to fulfill its strategy. If a company reaches the negotiations stage, that means the company was successful in choosing the market, even if negotiations are unsuccessful. And of course, well, the reasons can be very different, not only the institutional environment. So that was something I wanted to explain. So that's why I identified these 2 stages as separate stages, and I think that's where the novelty of my work is, because before these factors have not been considered before as critical factors in the process of mergers and acquisitions. Speaking of competitive advantages, I focused on institutional advantages. First of all, because this is very important for companies from emerging economies, because these advantages are maybe more important than for companies with developed economies. And as for transactional advantages, these are advantages which enable companies to transfer their knowledge to manage companies of such size, of branch offices. So these size of company and business group and asset-based advantages, this material and non-tangible, non-intangible assets. These two types of competitive advantage are certainly very important, and it's important to complete any international transaction without these advantages, but they are also important for companies from developed countries. But institutional advantages, this is something unique for companies from emerging economies, which I wanted to demonstrate in my thesis. A comment about sanctions. Yes, well, this is a very simplified model, which may or may not reflect some features. That's why I used another variable, such as GDP of Russia, which indicates the state of the economy, and maybe that variable reflects better the difficulties, the challenges that Russian companies had to face. It shows the slowing economic growth, and which I also included in my model. And speaking of various impact that different factors may have, institutional approach may explain some factors, but it doesn't. And John Dunning's model, this division of competitive advantages enables us to understand that competitive advantages may change over the time, and they may have different impacts over the time. And to make specific conclusions, I use the institutional approach, and to explain the results of competitive advantages, I tried to use Dunning's concept model. Maybe I was not quite clear about that, but I will work on that in the future. And speaking of limitations on the minimum transaction size, and you are right why I did not do this, because that will make my sample much smaller, because many information is missing, which is of course I introduced such a variable as share of like 59%, which, so we may believe that strategic acquisitions prevail, while portfolio investment is a minimum, that investment that do not affect the overall strategy of companies. Thank you, Professor Marinova. Let's hear your review, please.
Thank you very much. I will not repeat my review because it is readily available. I would like to emphasize that Liubov Ermolaeva in her PhD actually has made substantive contributions to knowledge in the area of mergers and acquisitions in general, and specifically in the context of Russian firms engaging in mergers and acquisitions. This is both in terms of using a three-stage model, and for me it is not so much a process model, but definitely clearly identify 3 stages. While the literature discusses mostly the 2 stages, however, the distinction between the stages could have been better explained, or the justification could have been strengthened. So overall, I think that all the publications and the final document actually point to one direction, that Liubov Ermolaeva deserves the award of candidate of economic sciences. Now, I would like to move towards some of the additional comments. Definitely one of the comments, and it's a key comment, is the role of informal institutions, because even if formal institutions are not with high degree of maturity, informal institutions can compensate for this immaturity, and actually informal institutions can play a much greater role in some of these mergers and acquisitions. And this is very important considering contexts such as former Yugoslavia with companies like Podravka and even to a large extent Russian firms. I would also like to point something very important in this respect, and these are the motives in which companies use in engaging in mergers and acquisitions. Because it seems to me that either seeking access to markets is a very different thing from access to strategic resources, and therefore the access to markets might be more readily available, but the access to strategic resources, such as new technology or new research and development, may be in some cases somewhat limited. So, and this nicely falls into Dunning's eclectic paradigm, including the later or the more recent development of the paradigm, including the institutional advantages. So motives have somehow to be considered, as well as the value of the target companies in view of the stage of the economic cycle. Because it is not so much the value of the target companies. I mean, in a recession, for example, some companies are sold for very little money because they are lacking or they have lost their competitiveness. So, and this is well known in the literature that Chinese companies, Indian companies have targeted specifically such firms for acquisition, and in such periods of time. Okay. Of course, I know that the data has have certain limitations and may not have allowed Liubov to consider these, but in terms of directions for future research, I think this is important. One further point for future research that might be considered, perhaps, is the upstream or downstream type of mergers and acquisitions. And in that sense, the search for complementary and compatible or similar strategic assets across national borders, because that would have an effect on the impact of institutional capital. Certainly, one more issue that is important is not only to consider institutional maturity in general, but the institutional maturity for outward foreign direct investment, in this case, in the Russian Federation. So the degree of the development of the outward foreign direct investment, excuse me, institutional or organizational system, and the degree of and the maturity of the institutional system for inward foreign direct investment in the target, in the countries of the targeted entities. Right. I think controlling for industry is very important, but maybe industry diversity may lead us to very interesting insights into the role of the industry sector in mergers and acquisitions, and that can be nicely related to institutional maturity or institutional political stability and institutional maturity, but also the degree of government interest. And I keep on repeating this with reference to Professor Paniblatov's work, because this is very important in terms of access to institutional capital in the home country. So overall, it's a very thorough well-organized PhD and publications related to the final document. Overall, excellent piece of work, and there are many directions for future research, I guess, that might enrich the understanding of this topic in the future. And I very much hope that Liubov Ermolaeva will continue working hard in this area of research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Svetla, could you repeat what is your conclusion in terms of the degree? I mean, our PhD degree. Mm-hmm.
Right. I started from there because I thought I would start with the good news. And my conclusion is that Liubov Ermolaeva meets the requirements for candidate of economic sciences, кандидат экономических наук. So, as I said, I started with a good piece of news, and then I went to point to some of the issues that might actually lead to more groundbreaking publications that can inform much better the area of mergers and acquisitions research in international business.
Спасибо большое. Пожалуйста,
Пожалуйста.
Уважаемая Светла, очень много было комментариев как раз о том, как можно развивать это исследование дальше. И
thesis can develop, and of course I will take your accounts into your comments into consideration. As for your critical comments, access to strategic resources, as I have already mentioned, 40% are oil and gas companies, and for them entering foreign markets, their main motive is access to consumers. So they want to sell their products. So maybe that might have affected my sample. And if we analyze what are the motives, of course this important motive is looking for new markets. Of course, it will be very interesting, useful to use a sample of companies that would exclude oil and gas sector, companies involved in mergers and acquisitions. We shall take a technical break till we re-establish connection to Svetla.
Hello, sorry about that.
Прошу продолжить трансляцию заседания.
Извините, пожалуйста.
Resume Let's resume broadcasting. I started to answer your comment about strategic resources, and of course in an ideal situation it would be very interesting to use as sample of companies that do not belong to the oil and gas sector, such as technology sector, metal processing sector, and analyze their motives. Then maybe we will get different information, different conclusions about their motives and their choice of markets. Of course, that could be the subject of a new major study, but because in Russia we mostly have oil and gas companies, and their main motive is search for new markets and consumers. I think that will be a new sphere of research. Thank you for your interest comment about the economic cycle of a particular company and when a transaction takes place. I did not look at this sphere at all in my thesis, though I agree this can be a very interesting sphere of research and many interesting, full of interesting findings. And speaking of institutional maturity in the home country and host country, and how these factor may affect incoming and outgoing investment. This was also a very valuable comment, which I could have included in my model by including variables reflecting institutional development in Russia, but I did not do that because I mostly focused on foreign markets. But I will take it into account now, and I agree this is an important factor to be considered. And data for other industries, I only used only two variables for oil and gas and technology sectors, maybe because my sample was not very big yet. I think that by introducing new variables, we can, our findings could be different. So have I answered all your comments? I believe I have.
Thank you. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Now let me, as the chairman of the Dissertation Council, read my review. I will focus on the key points, such as relevance of this research for international business. So this subject is highly relevant for practical the business practices, and because still some researchers findings are still missing. It's not a secret that there are not many studies have been conducted by Russian scientists, and not many publications in this sphere by Russian scientists. So this thesis is one of those few examples when the results of studies conducted by Russian researcher have novelty, and the findings are so well justified and validated, and the findings have been published in key and top international and national journals, such as regional studies magazines, several publications in other leading journals dedicated to emerging economies and international businesses, such as company internalization. And in relation to that, I would like to say that the results, the findings of the author have practical and theoretical significance, which is well validated by the publications, the number of publications, and the high opinion of international research community. I would also like to comment on how skillfully the author uses different theories, and the results of the empirical model have been very well tested and well validated by the use of qualitative analysis of an empirical study. And yet, despite all this, I'd like to say I was very impressed by the thesis, and all my comments are not criticism but recommendations for future research. And I think that this defense and presentation of is only the first step of a scientific career, as we could see today, as the author, the applicant, has already been offered several spheres for future research, for future study. Speaking of my personal comments, I hope they will become useful for your future career. My first comment is your main subject is Russian companies involved in international M&A transactions, and M&A strategy can be only one strategy for entering foreign markets used by Russian MNCs. So it will be interesting if you could explain if there are any differences for companies take part in M&As and other forms of other types of international strategy. And maybe you can also tell us what is the novelty of what has the model is analyzed on exactly this type of transactions. The second comment is approach to M&A transactions, where you distinguish three stages. But when speaking about the existing research, authors mostly focus on preparatory stage, and you mentioned that in your study, maybe not in enough detail, and so it's not clear why you identify exactly these stages as choice of target market, negotiations, and establishing the value. My third comment is about the types of competitive advantages. This classification of competitive advantages was added by Dunning to his model later, and though the model is generally accepted, there are few studies focused on these advantages, and accordingly the choice of this approach should be carefully justified and detailed in the paper. But that's only a comment, a recommendation. And finally, since in your study you talk not only about the Russian companies, but other companies from emerging economies, and I think you could devote more attention to the differences between, because obviously there are national peculiarities considering current situation, which makes Russia makes it different from other emerging companies. Yet these comments still believe that Liubov Ermolaeva dissertation is a complete scientific study, has novelty, meets all the requirements set forth to applicable to a thesis, and established by the St. Petersburg University order on awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. And I believe that the applicant, Ermolaeva Andreevna, deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Economic Sciences, specialization 080005, Economy and Management of the National Economy. Thank you, dear Galina Viktorovna. Maybe one question, why exactly this strategy was selected and how is it different? Generally, M&A transactions are becoming more and more popular in companies with emerging economies, and I have already given the reasons for that. And for Russian companies are no exception. More and more Russian companies are looking for access to strategic resources through M&A transactions. And well, these strategies different, such as contracting, and for example, the choice of market will be the strategy will be similar, but strategic goals will be in each case will be different. And that is why this model can be applied to emerging acquisitions only. Perhaps for other forms of investments, such as greenfield, this model can also be used, could be applied, because the final goals will be different, and different factors will play a significant role. And I accept all the other comments about processes, about justification of selection of the use of Dunning's model. I absolutely agree. This is something I will develop in my future research and make it more. Thank you for its inspiration. Thank you, Liubov Andreevna. Now let us proceed to the next item on our agenda. Does any of the attendees who is not a member of the Dissertation Council, if no one wishes to speak, let us give the floor to the academic advisor, Pani Brata Andreevich, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor of Department of Strategic and International Management of St. Petersburg University. Dear colleagues, dear members of the Dissertation Council, I will make my speech short. I would like to say that Liubov Andreevna indeed is a researcher who has achieved great results, but usually the academic advisor talks about personal qualities of the applicant. So I would like to first of all thank Liubov Andreevna for her for being so devoted to her research. She took part in many projects in which I took part, or which I was director, and her contribution was very significant, very valuable with my research team. So we were able to achieve good results, to develop field and results. So we had the opportunity to demonstrate good potential of our team. And secondly, Liubov Andreevna is my best student. Well, and I haven't been in this position for many years, but so far she's my best doctoral student. And I believe, so we have many talented young scientists at GSOM, doctoral students of my respected, students of my respected colleagues. But I dare say that Liubov Andreevna is among the top 5 or top 3% of those young researchers, young scientists, doctoral students. and Liubov Andreevna's, she graduated our school. She took part in she took part in the work of the laboratory, and I hope in the future she will stay with us. And thank you, Andrei Yurievich. Thank you, everybody. So now time has come for the discussion of the dissertation council members, and for that period of time, please disable, stop broadcasting, and also I'm kindly requesting all the attendees are not members of the dissertation council to leave the room, and I will invite you to come back when our discussion is over. Thank you.
Заседание продолжается.
Let us resume the meeting. So please turn the sound on and make sure we are on air. The most important moment of our meeting has come. I now put the awarding the academic degree to the open individual voting. Let me remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Council shall be considered positive if more than a half, but not less than 3 members of the Council taking part in the meeting voted for it in accordance with Article 23 of the procedure for awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, Appendix 1 to the order. Council member Gavrilova Tatiana Albertovna, your opinion. I support. Council members Avyalova Elena Kirillovna, your opinion. I am for. Council member Rogova Elena Moiseyevna, your opinion. I am for. I support. Thesis. Council member Svetla Marinova, your opinion.
I support the award of candidate of economic sciences.
Спасибо.
Thank you. And chairman of the council, Shrokova Galina Viktorovna, I also support thesis and I'm voting for. Thus, dear colleagues and guests, I would like to announce that out of 5 members of the dissertation participating in the meeting, 5 voted for, no one voted against, and no one abstained. The decision to award the degree of candidate of economic sciences, specialization 080005, economics and management of the national economy, to Ermolaeva Liubov Andreevna has been made. Let us give the floor to the applicant for her final address. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, thank you so much for taking part in this procedure, for your valuable comments, for asking me such good questions that will enable me to develop as a researcher in the future. I very much appreciate your work. Thank you, Andrei Yurievich, for your support, encouragement, and assistance with various academic and technical issues. That was very important and very relevant for me. And finally, we achieved the desired result. I waited for this defense procedure for a long time. I am very happy this happened because my friends and my family were next to me and supported me. And they believed that I will be successful. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, everybody. I now declare the session closed. Thank you all for your participation, and please stop the online broadcasting.